Picture this. You're standing in the magnificent halls of the great palace of Constantinople in the year 1042 AD, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. An 11-year-old girl, barely tall enough to see over the altar, walks toward a man who could be her great-grandfather. Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, 64 years old, reaches out with liver-spotted hands to claim his new bride. The courtiers smile and offer congratulations, but whispers follow in their wake, because everyone in that room knows the horrifying truth. This child is being sold into a nightmare dressed as a wedding ceremony. And what Constantine does to Theodora Porphyrogenita over the next 13 years represents one of the most disturbing examples of institutional child abuse in recorded history. But here's what nobody expected. What she becomes afterward will terrify you even more than what was done to her. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Byzantine intrigue. It's the story of how a child forced into unimaginable circumstances transformed herself into one of the most feared rulers in Byzantine history. The name Theodora Porphyrogenita might not be familiar to you, but her story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Because this isn't a story about a victim who stayed a victim. This is something far more complex, far more disturbing. But to understand what Theodora became, we need to understand what was taken from her. Let's start 13 years before that wedding in 1029 AD, when everything began to unravel. Constantinople, in the early 11th century, was the greatest city on earth, a sprawling metropolis of perhaps 500,000 souls, where East met West in a dazzling fusion of power and paranoia. The city's walls had stood unconquered for 7 centuries. Its churches gleamed with gold mosaics that seemed to capture divine light itself. But beneath this magnificent surface lurked something that made Roman politics look civilized by comparison. The Byzantine court was a snake pit, where today's trusted advisor became tomorrow's blinded exile, where brothers poisoned brothers, where the only currency that mattered was proximity to imperial power. And into this world, Theodora was born with both the greatest privilege and the most terrible curse imaginable. She was born in the purple, literally born in the purple-draped chamber reserved for imperial births, making her Porphyrogenita. This wasn't just a title, it was a brand that marked her as valuable property in the empire's endless power games. But here's what nobody tells you about being born into absolute privilege. Sometimes the cage is made of gold, but it's still a cage. When her father, Emperor Constantine VIII, died in 1028, 7-year-old Theodora's world transformed overnight. Her oldest sister Zoe became empress, but Byzantine tradition demanded a male co-ruler. What followed was a parade of husbands for Zoe, each more unsuitable than the last, each dying under mysterious circumstances. And young Theodora? She watched. She learned. She understood that in this palace, survival meant invisibility. For the next 14 years, Theodora lived in the Gyneceum, the women's quarters of the palace. It was simultaneously heaven and hell. Walls adorned with frescoes depicting saints and angels, floors of polished marble reflecting candlelight like still water, gardens growing flowers whose perfume was intoxicating. But for Theodora, it was a gilded prison whose bars were made of silk and gold. She could see the city below through latticed windows, but never walk its streets. She could hear the roar of the hippodrome, where 100,000 spectators watched chariot races, but she would never join them. Here's what the history books won't tell you. Those years of forced isolation, of watching and waiting, of appearing powerless, they were actually her greatest education. While everyone assumed she was just another forgotten princess embroidering in her chambers, Theodora was doing something far more dangerous. She was learning exactly how power worked in Byzantium. Every whispered conversation she overheard, every political execution she witnessed from behind silk curtains, every betrayal, every alliance, every murder, she catalogued it all. But nobody knew. Not yet. By 1042, the political situation had reached a breaking point. Sister Zoe was in her 60s, married to Constantine Reich Monomachos, and the aristocratic families who actually controlled Byzantine power were growing nervous. They needed stability. They needed insurance against another succession crisis. And that's when someone, we'll never know exactly who, suggested a solution that was as brilliant as it was monstrous. What if Constantine married both sisters? The proposal was unprecedented, shocking even by Byzantine standards where pretty much everything had already been tried. But it would solve everything. Bind both branches of the imperial family together, give the aristocrats their precious stability, and all it would cost was one little girl's childhood. Theodora was 11 years old. She had no say in the matter, of course. In the Byzantine political system, women of the imperial family were resources to be allocated, not individuals with agency. But here's the thing that will make your skin crawl. This wasn't unusual. The fact that she was 11 and he was 64 made no difference. The fact that he was already married to her sister made no difference. The fact that this arrangement would place a child in a position of complete vulnerability to an elderly man who held absolute power over her existence, none of this mattered compared to political expediency. Because in Byzantium, children of the imperial family weren't children. They were chess pieces. And Theodora had just been moved into play. The wedding took place in Hagia Sophia, that architectural miracle whose dome seemed to float unsupported, whose gold mosaics multiplied light until the entire space seemed to glow with divine presence. For the thousands of observers, it must have been magnificent. For Theodora, walking down that impossibly long nave in silk robes, so heavy she could barely move, it must have felt like walking to her own execution. Ancient sources don't tell us what Theodora thought or felt during the ceremony. Byzantine historians cared about politics and theology, not the inner lives of little girls. But we can imagine, can't we? The incense so thick it made breathing difficult. The chanting of priests whose words she'd memorized from a lifetime of compulsory religious observance. The weight of the crown placed on her head, and Constantine beside her, this old man with liver-spotted hands and heavy breathing, who would now have legal and cultural authority over every aspect of her existence. What makes this arrangement particularly grotesque was what it meant in practice. Byzantine law allowed girls to be betrothed at 7 and married at 12, though consummation was theoretically supposed to wait until puberty. But these were guidelines, not hard rules, and they certainly didn't apply to emperors. Theodora's marriage to Constantine gave him rights that we would recognize as institutionalized abuse, but in 11th century Byzantium were simply the prerogatives of power. The palace that became Theodora's new prison was a city within a city. The great palace complex covered hundreds of acres: throne rooms, churches, barracks, gardens, libraries, treasuries, prisons, and the private imperial apartments where Theodora now lived. These apartments were labyrinthine, designed to confuse potential assassins, but which also served to isolate their inhabitants from any escape. Here, in rooms whose walls were covered with silk hangings, and whose floors were heated by ancient Roman systems, Theodora lived a life that looked like luxury but felt like suffocation. Her daily routine was rigidly structured by Byzantine court protocol, a system so complex that following it correctly required years of training. She woke before dawn. She dressed with the help of female servants whose every movement was choreographed by centuries of tradition. She attended religious services that lasted for hours. She presided over formal dinners where every gesture, every word, every glance was laden with political meaning. And through it all, she was expected to maintain perfect composure, never showing weakness, never revealing emotion, always performing imperial dignity. But the worst part, the part that ancient sources hint at but never fully describe, was her relationship with Constantine. We'll never know the full details of what happened behind closed doors in those imperial apartments. The sources are silent, as they always are when it comes to the suffering of women and children in positions of powerlessness. But we know enough. We know that Theodora's body was not her own, that it belonged to the empire, to be used in whatever way served imperial interests, that refusing the emperor was not just impossible but literally unthinkable. Byzantine sources tell us Constantine was not particularly cruel by the standards of his time. He was cultured, educated, interested in theology and philosophy. But he was also a product of a system that viewed women generally, and young girls specifically, as property rather than persons. His kindness, such as it was, came in the form of expensive gifts and access to palace luxuries. What he could not give Theodora was freedom, agency, or even basic acknowledgement of her humanity beyond her dynastic value. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody sees coming. Byzantine sources tell us that Theodora became increasingly withdrawn and pious during these years. She spent hours in private prayer. She gave generous donations to monasteries and churches. She avoided court functions when possible. Modern psychologists would recognize these as trauma responses, religious devotion as coping mechanism, withdrawal as self-protection. But what everyone missed, what even the most observant courtiers failed to notice, was that Theodora wasn't just coping. She was preparing. Remember those years as a child, watching from behind silk curtains, cataloguing every betrayal and alliance? She'd never stopped. All those hours spent in apparent religious devotion? She was actually meeting with informants, building a spy network, learning which aristocrats were stealing from the treasury, which generals were planning rebellion, which court officials could be trusted and which were secretly plotting. Every charitable donation to a monastery, it bought her loyal supporters in the religious establishment. Every withdrawn moment in her private chambers, she was reading correspondence, studying financial records, understanding the mechanics of Byzantine power at a level that most emperors never achieved. For 13 years, while everyone thought she was a broken, traumatized girl playing the role of empress, Theodora was actually constructing an invisible empire of information and influence. And nobody knew. Not Constantine. Not his advisors. Not the aristocratic families who thought they controlled everything. The mouse was becoming a lion, and the lion was patient. Then, in 1055, Constantine died. Her sister Zoe had died the year before. Theodora was now 24 years old, and for the first time in her life, she had a choice. Byzantine succession law was complicated, but one thing was clear. As a legitimate empress and porphyrogenita, Theodora had a stronger claim to the throne than any other living person. The aristocratic families assumed she would be controllable. A woman who had spent her entire adult life in the shadows, who had never shown political ambition, who seemed content with prayer and charity. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The transformation was startling. When the aristocrats suggested she should marry one of their chosen candidates, she refused, flatly. When they insisted, she had the most aggressive ones arrested. When they plotted against her, she uncovered their plots through the spy network nobody knew she had. The arrests that followed were surgical and terrifying. She knew everything, which families had been embezzling, which generals had been planning coups, which bureaucrats had been taking bribes. Information she'd been quietly gathering for over a decade suddenly became weapons, and she wielded them without mercy. Theodora ruled as sole empress for the next 19 months, and her reign revealed something extraordinary. All those years of forced silence hadn't been wasted. She knew exactly which aristocratic families posed threats. She knew which bureaucrats were competent and which were corrupt. She reorganized the imperial treasury, cracked down on tax evasion, strengthened Constantinople's defenses, stabilized the currency. She did all of this while maintaining the appearance of proper Byzantine imperial dignity, never giving her enemies an excuse to call her behavior unseemly. But what makes Theodora's story truly remarkable is what she chose not to do. She never married again. Despite enormous pressure to take a husband who could provide military leadership and male heirs, she refused. She had experienced what Byzantine marriage meant for an imperial woman. She was finished with it. She would rule alone, or not at all. This was unprecedented, shocking, and it worked because by the time anyone realized what was happening, she had already consolidated enough power that removing her would have meant civil war. Ancient sources describe her final months with a kind of awe. She was dying, probably cancer, and she knew it. She spent her last weeks systematically preparing for succession, choosing a moderate man named Michael VI, making sure he understood that his legitimacy came entirely from her choice, binding him with oaths that would preserve her reforms. She died in August 1056, having ruled effectively and independently for 19 months. She was 25 years old. The trajectory of Theodora's life reads like something impossible, the child bride who became the empress, the victim who became the victor. But here's what makes this story so disturbing. There is no happy ending here. Theodora's triumph came at an enormous cost. The price of her political effectiveness was the complete suppression of whatever she might have been if the system had allowed her to simply be a child, then a teenager, then a young woman making her own choices. We will never know what Theodora might have wanted if the choice had been hers. Maybe she would have loved being empress. Maybe she would have chosen religious life. Maybe she would have wanted to study philosophy or poetry. All of these possibilities were stolen from her at age 11, replaced with a role she had no choice but to perfect or die trying. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Theodora to survive and eventually thrive are the same ones we see in modern survivors of long-term abuse. Compartmentalization, strategic thinking, the conversion of powerlessness into hidden forms of power. But understanding these mechanisms doesn't make them less tragic. Theodora shouldn't have needed to develop them. She should have been allowed to be 11 years old. What makes her story particularly relevant today is how little has fundamentally changed. We still have child marriages in many parts of the world. We still have systems that place children in situations where they must choose between different forms of exploitation. We still create environments where survival requires children to grow up too fast, to suppress their own needs and desires, to perform maturity they haven't actually achieved. The historical sources that tell us about Theodora are frustratingly sparse on personal details. Byzantine historians cared about political events, not a little girl's fear or an empress's loneliness. We can infer these things from the actions she took, from the choices she made when she finally had choices to make, from the fact that she never married again. But we can't know with certainty what she thought or felt during those 13 years, and that silence is itself telling. Perhaps the most important lesson from Theodora's life is about the difference between coping and thriving. She coped brilliantly, developing psychological strategies that allowed her not just to survive, but eventually to seize power and wield it effectively. But coping is not the same as thriving. True thriving would have meant never being placed in circumstances that required such extreme coping mechanisms in the first place. Byzantine civilization ended in 1453 when Constantinople finally fell. The great palace where Theodora lived was destroyed, its ruins eventually disappearing beneath modern Istanbul. But the patterns that shaped Theodora's life persist, because they're rooted not in Byzantine culture specifically, but in the universal human tendency of the powerful to exploit the powerless when systems allow it. Tonight, somewhere in the world, another child is being forced into circumstances that will require them to develop the same kinds of psychological armor that Theodora developed. They might not be Byzantine princesses, but they're facing the same essential dynamic. Powerful people making decisions about their lives without their consent. Systems that treat children as means rather than ends. And like Theodora, some will survive. Some will even thrive. But survival is not justice, and thriving despite trauma is not the same as never being traumatized in the first place. If this story affected you, if it made you think about how power works and who pays the price for political stability, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from? Does your own culture have similar stories of children sacrificed to adult ambitions? The conversation matters because the patterns Theodora experienced still echo through our world, wearing different clothes, but following the same basic script. Understanding that script is the first step toward finally rewriting it.